All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kishore Varanasi. I am a member of the board of Boston Harbor Now, and I serve as the chair of the Policy and Planning Committee. Welcome. I'll be the host for today's conversation. We have a really exciting group of people from various departments at the city of Boston. Looking forward to the discussion. If this is your first time joining the Harbor Use Forum, this is a monthly event that takes place organized by Boston Harbor Now to engage all of us in a conversation around what's happening around the harbor projects, whether it's private or public. Again, for those who are returning, thanks for making this a continued success. Boston Harbor Now is a nonprofit that is increasingly vested in making sure that our waterfront is resilient, inclusive, and welcoming to everyone from all around the city and the region. Our activities are quite wide-ranging. They include anything from writing comment letters on projects around the harbor to making sure that there is water transportation and looking at the future of water transportation and ferries, to making sure that we bring underserved communities to both the waterfront and the harbor islands. So today, as I mentioned, we have a great panel. We are doing this over Zoom. We've found it to be quite successful. More and more people are attending this, so we'll continue to be on Zoom for a while. But first, before I introduce the panel of presenters, we have a poll. I would like to ask you two questions. Alice, you're going to post something on Zoom. Should I just read it out? Okay, so there they are. They're on your screen. The first question is, where do you spend most of your time? We have a few different options. And the second is, what is your level of familiarity with Boston's climate-ready plans? So please click away. And we'll just give everybody a second to do this, and we'll come back with answers.
Well, it's great to see people from all over the region who are participating in the conversation, as well as a solid representation from East Boston and Charlestown. And great to see that there's a range of people, including 3 folks who are just learning about these plans for the first time, and another 40% who know a little and are here to learn more. So thanks for coming today.
Great, thank you. Yes, great to see that wide-ranging representation, but today's topics are certainly focused on East Boston and Charlestown, so we see a good representation there. So today we're joined by Kat McCandless, the Climate Change and Environmental Planning Project Manager from the Boston's Environmental Department, Allison Perlman, B. Chatfield, who both are project managers and landscape architects from Boston Parks and Recreation Department, and lastly, Delaney Morris, who is a resilience and waterfront planner for the BPDA, Boston Planning and Development Agency. Kat will share some information about the Climate Ready Boston programs, as well as phase 1 and phase 2 of coastal resilience solutions for East Boston and Charlestown. Phase 2, I believe, was just released last month, so it's hot off of press, so we're looking forward to hearing about it today. And then Allison, B, and Delaney will talk about the designs for climate adaptation projects that were featured in the phase 1 plans of these neighborhoods in 2017. So I'm going to turn it over to Kat to take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kishore, for the introduction. I'll get my slides pulled up. All right, can everybody see that okay? Great. All right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you all so much for being here with us bright and early at this month's Harbor Use Public Forum. As Kishore said, my name is Catherine McCandless. I work with the City of Boston's Environment Department on the Climate Ready Boston initiative, and B and Allison and Delaney and I are really excited to be here with you today to share some of our work with the City of Boston. As Kishore mentioned, the 4 of us work between the Environment Department, the Parks and Recreation Department, and the Boston Planning and Development Agency on climate resilience planning and implementation. So I'll be kicking off our presentation this morning with an overview of climate impacts and the Climate Ready Boston initiative for folks who may be less familiar with our work. And we'll then go over the 2 phases of coastal resilience solutions planning for the neighborhoods of East Boston and Charlestown and kind of what this work entails. Then my 3 amazing colleagues from the BPDA and Parks will share their work on advancing and implementing some of the near-term priority projects that were identified in the phase 1 plan. All right, so let's dive in. So as the climate changes, we're experiencing impacts including extreme temperatures, greater volumes of precipitation, sea level rise, and an increase in the frequency and intensity of coastal storms. These impacts create 3 climate hazards that threaten our health and our safety and our environment, both the built and the natural environment. So, rising temperatures result in higher average temperatures, more frequent and extreme heat waves and droughts like we've been experiencing this year. More precipitation can lead to inland stormwater flooding, which is a particularly big issue in urban environments like Boston, where there's a higher concentration of impervious surfaces that prevent water from draining quickly or at all when there's a flood. And last, sea level rise coupled with more frequent and intense coastal storms causes coastal and riverine flooding as well as stormwater flooding. And while we're working on addressing all of these hazards in the city, much of our presentation today is going to focus on how we're working to address coastal flooding. So in Boston, projections indicate that sea levels are likely to rise from 2013 levels by approximately 9 inches as early as 2030 and by approximately 36 inches by 2070. Plus, there will be an additional 4 inches of something called land subsidence, which is the gradual settling and sinking of land. So consequently, by 2070, we anticipate approximately 40 inches of sea level rise across the city, or about 3 feet, and storms of greater magnitudes will become more frequent and more intense. However, climate change is not a future issue. It's already here. We've been incredibly lucky that we've not yet experienced a storm of the magnitude of, say, like Hurricane Sandy in New York or Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, but Boston has experienced significant flooding. These images are from 2018 when Boston experienced 2 nor'easters between January and March. And these storms gave us a glimpse of what flooding could look like and do to our coastal city and illustrates the importance of adapting to the impacts of climate change like sea level rise that we simply can't take back, even if we were to completely eliminate our greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow. So the city is taking a layered approach to building resilience. We're working to adapt our buildings and our infrastructure to withstand the impacts of flooding and extreme heat and better manage stormwater. We're working to prepare and connect our communities through education and engagement, updating local policy and zoning to reflect climate initiatives, and supporting economic development opportunities through green workforce development initiatives like the recently established Boston Power Corps. And we're working to protect the Boston coastline through our work on the Climate Ready Boston initiative. So for anyone who may not be familiar, and it sounds like we have a few folks in the room who are not, the Climate Ready Boston initiative began in 2016 with the release of the Climate Ready Boston report, which provided an updated projections of climate change impacts in the future in Boston, an assessment of the city's vulnerability to those impacts, and a roadmap for adapting to these impacts across the city. And since 2016, this report has evolved into an ongoing initiative that until recently has been largely focused on coastal resilience planning for Boston's 5 coastal neighborhoods. So in 2017, we released the first phase of planning for East Boston and Charlestown. And this was followed by a plan for South Boston in 2018, downtown and North End and Dorchester in 2020, and the second phase of planning for East Boston and Charlestown, which was just completed in August of this year. We're very excited about the release of this recent plan, the phase 2 plan, because with the completion of coastal resilience solutions for East Boston and Charlestown phase 2, the city has developed resilience plans for all 47 miles of Boston's coastline. I want to note that the Climate Ready Boston is just one of many efforts across the city to build resilience, specifically looking at coastal flooding. So for example, in 2018, you can see right here, the Public Works Department released its climate resilience design standards and guidelines for the protection of public right-of-ways. In 2018, the BPDA released coastal flood resilience design guidelines that provide guidance on building level adaptation strategies. And in 2021, these guidelines were formalized in the city's zoning code as the Coastal Flood Resilience Overlay District. And this requires that development projects that are over 20,000 square feet that are in the projected floodplain through 2070 integrate resilience measures into their designs. And in 2022, the Climate Ready Boston Initiative also released a plan called Heat Resilient Solutions for Boston to assess and address the impacts of rising temperatures on our communities. So this work is really an all hands on deck, interdisciplinary and interagency effort that isn't limited to a single department in the city, which I think our panel today really reflects. All right, so now I'm going to share an overview of the 2 phases of coastal resilience solutions planning for East Boston and Charlestown. This map shows the delineation of the phase 1 and phase 2 study areas. So phase 1, shown in this sort of peach colored line, if you can see my mouse, covered the harbor facing portion of East Boston's waterfront along Jeffreys Point, the Maverick Square area, and the Border Street area, as well as the northern area of Charlestown along the Mystic River. And phase 2, which is shown in the red line, built upon this first phase and covered East Boston's Chelsea Creek, around the border to Revere, the Belle Isle Marsh, Constitution Beach and Wood Island Marsh, as well as the Charlestown Navy Yard, the Little Mystic Channel, and the Boston Autoport. Oh, there we go. So in case you're wondering why these 2 neighborhoods were divided into 2 phases, you wouldn't be the first to ask. While this was before my time with the city, the primary reason that the phase 1 study area was separated from the phase 2 study area was to address significant flood pathways in the phase 1 study area that present extensive near-term flood risk and really needed to be addressed early. With all of the coastal resilience solutions plans that we've been doing, there are essentially 3 key goals and objectives. The first is to identify the precise location and timing of flood risk in a given study area. And flood risk assessments in these plans include sea level rise projections, possible storm surge under different storm scenarios, and wave action and erosion. It also includes identifying the ways in which flooding can occur, which include either fringe flooding or flood pathways. So fringe flooding typically impacts low-lying areas along the waterfront, whereas flood pathways allow water to travel from low-lying land on the waterfront to inland areas, which is especially concerning given that most inland structures and infrastructure are not designed to, with flooding in mind. So much of Climate Ready Boston's work focuses on blocking flood pathways and reducing fringe flooding by elevating vulnerable areas of the coastline to protect our communities. So the images to the left show the location of projected flooding in the phase 1 study area, while the images to the right show the same for the phase 2 study area. These images present a near and long-term flood risk. We consider nearer-term flood risk to include a 1% annual chance storm with 9 inches of sea level rise, which I mentioned earlier is anticipated around the year 2030, while longer-term flood risk includes a 1% annual chance storm with 40 inches of sea level rise that's anticipated around the year 2070. And as you can see from these maps, without intervention, large sections of East Boston and Charlestown will be vulnerable to flooding at an increasingly frequent basis. The second goal of these plans is to engage stakeholders, including the local community, nonprofit organizations, city, state, and federal agencies, the private sector, and many more, to develop place-based coastal resilience solutions that provide multiple benefits for the respective community, such as increasing permeable open space and promoting multimodal transportation opportunities and enhancing access to the waterfront. So strategies largely depend on the site-specific location and may include solutions such as waterfront parks, which you'll hear a bit about today, landscaped berms, flood walls, elevating the harbor walk or roadways, or nature-based solutions like restoring wetlands. These plans typically present preferred solutions that encapsulate the most community benefits and ecological benefits, as well as alternative options that would be effective but potentially less desirable. And the third goal of these plans is to create an implementation roadmap that outlines the timing by which solutions need to be constructed to address flood risk, as well as next steps for advancing each proposed project that's identified through the plans. So for example, here is an implementation timeline for projects identified through the phase 1 study in East Boston. And by mapping this out, this enables us to prioritize projects that require actions to mitigate near-term flood risk. And 2 of these projects that were identified in the phase 1 plan and are shown on this timeline are projects that will be discussed during this presentation, which are listed here as the Greenway entrance and the Clipper Ship Hodge berm, but have since been given new project names, and you'll hear a bit about that in a few minutes. All right, so I want to conclude my segment of this presentation by talking about what comes after the plans. The plans present conceptual designs that have been informed by significant community and stakeholder engagement and are deeply vetted for technical feasibility. And from there, each project must go through additional stages of design, engineering, and environmental permitting and compliance before it's ready for construction. And engagement with stakeholders spans all stages of these next steps and is critical for informing what the ultimate form that a given strategy will take. I think that in doing this work as a planner, folks often worry that what they see in the plans are final and will begin construction as they're presented in a plan. But the plans are just the first step in the implementation process and aim to set a framework that really comprehensively addresses risk across a large geography. So I'm happy to answer more questions about the specifics of the plans during the Q&A. But now I'd like to pass the torch over to my colleagues who have been working on advancing several of the near-term actions from the phase 1 plan. So B, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kat. Excuse me. I am B. Chatfield, and I'm a landscape architect and project manager with the Parks Department. And so here we are zooming in from our planning process into our implementation, John J. Ryan Playground. So we started our community process a year ago, almost exactly in September of 2021, and we are now in final design and permitting. Our process has taken a little bit longer than our standard parks design process, which is usually 6 to 8 months. And we're making it, the reason for this is we're making a real effort to coordinate with numerous other Charlestown construction projects, and that has been challenging and interesting to say the least. So if we go to the next slide. We have our Charlestown open space context here. And you can see in the sort of upper left corner, this is where the playground is. Ryan Playground is one of the largest open spaces in Charlestown, and it's about 9 acres. Charlestown has an average of 3 acres of open space per 1,000 residents, which is one of the lowest resident to open space ratios in Boston. So this park plays a vital role for the community. This is just showing, all of the other different open spaces, some of which are Parks Department, some which are not, but just to give you a sense of the area. And, we're not addressing Somerville here and Everett, even though those are municipalities that probably cross the bridge, probably walk over Alfred Street and use this space as well. So if we go to the next slide, Frederick Law Olmsted did a design for this park, which is shown here from 1891. And the design included a riverfront promenade and alleys of trees, athletic fields. And, before this project was implemented, this area was really sort of wetland, and the project spent most of a decade filling the site, and then funding ran out. So it was finally realized with only the ball fields. So the original design was never really implemented. Second, go to the next slide, please. Over time, the park has been sort of whittled away, reacting to the various alignments of streets surrounding it. The waterfront has always remained the same, and it's always been a hard edge with a seawall. You can see here in the 1930s, there was a field house, tennis and handball courts. If we go to the next slide, you can see even further adjustment of the alignment. Here's 1969, where the active recreation component was really brought out more fully. You have a children's playground, some more ball fields, and the park has continued to be renovated over the years, depending on what activities the community has desired. If we go to the next slide, we see the current aerial of the park, the edge along the Mystic River, You can see there, it's really a hard edge. You've got a granite seawall with the harbor walk. And there you have Alfred Street and Sullivan Square, and you can see our neighbor to the south, the Shraff City Center. On to the next slide. This is an existing site analysis. Today we have a children's playground, street hockey rink, a field house, 4 ball fields, and a number of support structures for those ball fields, and large parking areas. And there are many mature trees around the perimeter of the playground. You can see some of these blue arrows sort of indicate site access points. All of this is surrounded by fencing. It's a wonderful space, but there's certainly a lot of room for improvement. We can go to the next slide. So we started our community process working with 2 adjacent projects with what we understood to be similar schedules. Those schedules have since adjusted somewhat, but we have the Rutherford Avenue Sullivan Square redesign with MassDOT and BTD, and then the Hood Green redevelopment. And so the outlines of the primary open spaces resulting from these 2 projects, 3 projects really, are shown above, and they're all really a short walk from Ryan Playground. Parks and BPDA hosted a joint meeting with BTD and Hood Green to ask community members about the programming of these sites and what the priorities were for each. So no real surprises, I guess, as far as Ryan was concerned, because as the largest of these 3 spaces, with its historical use being primarily active recreation, this was deemed to be the best use. And so we're going to continue with that use primarily for the site. But we really wanted to provide a stronger physical connection and openness towards the new Sullivan Square open space, and emphasizing that connectivity is a really important step. You can also see, interestingly, there's a proposed extension onto Ryan Playground that will result from the Rutherford Avenue realignment. And it's exciting to see that the outlines of the playground are going to start to be sort of readjusted, not quite back to their historical size, but anyway, we're regaining a little bit of space, which is great. So if we could go to the next slide. Existing conditions and climate resiliency. If we go on to the next slide. So once we had started our public process and had an understanding a little bit of what programs people were looking for and how sort of regionally connected we wanted to make our park, we sort of zoomed into the flood risk assessment. And obviously we understood this is a flood pathway. This is a very significant project as far as protecting Charlestown waterfront and inland and Somerville and Cambridge. All of these areas connect to Ryan Playground. So we did a couple of different models just to sort of see what the results were. There's the Boston Harbor flood risk model, and then there's the Mass Coastal flood risk model, which is a little bit more conservative. And you can see that by 2070, our site is virtually non-existent. So we went with the more conservative model. Right now, the elevation at the water's edge is 16 feet, and we will be increasing it by 12 feet so that we're going to have elevation 22. So if we, sorry, 6 feet, not 16 feet. If we go on to the next slide. So this shows the existing flood risk map right now, and you can see our site in the foreground in the white triangle. And the adjacent property is the Shraff City Center, where you can see the really significant current 1% annual flood entry point in the dark blue. A small portion of that is on Ryan Playground. And so that is one of the reasons why we are addressing our site, but we are also working with that project as well. If we go on to the next slide, you can see there's our project with the solid red line going up to elevation 22 at the water's edge. And then the Shraff City Center has said that they're also going to be going up to elevation 22 as well. So it's really a comprehensive sort of protection zone in this area, really cutting off that flood pathway. So if we go on to the next slide, and the next, we've got the preferred site plan. This shows the phasing. Phase 1 is just going to be the playground as we know it today. And then once the Rutherford Avenue realignment redesign project has occurred, we're going to address phase 2, the proposed extension. If we go on to the next slide, this shows the phase 1 playground. Starting over by the water's edge, we have sort of a viewing deck planned. This is essentially, there's going to be a large berm. That is our flood protection. a large berm that is somewhat inland of the seawall. And there are a few reasons for that I'll show in the next few slides. But right now we have a viewing deck, and then there's a harbor walk. There is a new playground and a splash pad. The splash pad and the trees and shading that we're going to be implementing for the ball field sort of dugout areas. We are certainly aware that heat is one of the elements of climate change that we're trying to address. And so bringing water and its use to the park users is something that we're focusing on in our various park renovations. We also have other recreation benefits here, adult fitness areas, ways for people to really try and gather and enjoy the view over the harbor and over the river, looking out at Everett, looking out at the river. Right now, its existing condition, it's ball fields up to the edge, which is great. But we're really trying to allow people to gather at the water's edge and appreciate it, and not just retreat from the flooding. We also have 4 ball fields shown here, pickleball. We're relocating the existing hockey rink and reducing the parking areas. If we can go on to the next slide, we'll see the preferred plan in all phases. So that's with the additional sort of wedge of land that we're going to be trying to engage more physically with the new Sullivan Square open space, have more of an entryway, an entry plaza with a shade structure and some seating, some bocce courts. And the last slide that we have here, actually, before we go onto that slide, I want to indicate on the water's edge, we've got 3 section lines called out. There's section A, B, and C as you move down the water's edge. And so if we go on to the next slide, these sections are cut through those areas. And so you can see that we're creating our flood prevention, not really as like a sharp wall, but as a berm. We want it to be accessible and useful. And it's done inland of the existing seawall. One of those reasons the seawall is Army Corps, and permitting would be very challenging, but primarily it's in acceptable condition, but it's an engineering issue if we wanted to build directly on top of it and elevate in that manner. So there's also a 24-inch diameter medium pressure gas line that is inboard of the seawall, and we could not build a berm on top of that. So you can see the sort of support structures that exist to varying depths. We're going down to this berm and the sort of platform areas. These are to be supported on piles, going down to resistance, about 40 feet potentially. And we'll be building the berm out of earth in some places, but also engineered lightweight fill. So as of now, our project is in permitting. We may be required to do an environmental impact report. So that has bumped our implementation, our construction timeline back a little bit from what we originally anticipated. And so we're now looking to break ground in the spring of 2024. And so with that, I want to turn it over to the East Boston Reliance Waterfront project.
Thanks, Bea. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned earlier, my name is Delaney Morris, she, her. I am a resilience and waterfront planner at the Boston Planning and Development Agency on the climate change and environmental planning team. Our mission on the CCEP team is to promote an active, accessible, and resilient waterfront and to advance climate-ready, carbon-neutral, and environmentally sustainable buildings. I'm also joined today by my colleague, Chris Bush, who's in the audience, and he's able to help answer any questions about this project as well. I actually started at the BPDA in June, so the two of us will likely be tag teaming any questions that you have. Next slide, please. East Boston is a vibrant and historic neighborhood, which I'm sure you are all already aware of, where climate resilient solutions are critical to protecting the future of the community. On this map here, you can see where East Boston is currently at risk from the 1% annual chance coastal flooding. This graphic was produced as a part of that Climate Ready Boston's Phase 1 report that Kat mentioned earlier from 2017. And you can see the flood pathways that are already going to be providing significant impact to the community. You can go to the next slide, please. So I want to call out that I'll be talking about these projects that are happening in the highlighted areas of Carlton Wharf and Lewis Mall, where these flood pathways are significant. These were identified as high priority, as Kat mentioned earlier in that graphic that you saw. And in the next piece of the presentation, Allison Perlman will actually be talking about some of that inland area there along the Greenway. But I'll be walking through these two project sites, Carlton Wharf and Lewis Mall, Lewis Street area. Next slide. So before getting into the projects themselves, I'd like to go through with you all where we are in terms of funding and just the process in general. So following the identification of these areas for near-term implementation, the BPDA had applied for the state's Coastal Zone Management or CZM grant. This happened in September of 2020. And in that month, the BPDA was awarded $300,000 from CZM for the technical analysis and development of resilient design options for East Boston's waterfront at Carlton Wharf and Lewis Mall. In October of 2020, the BPDA board voted to approve of accepting these funds, and an RFP was issued to complete this phase of the project. Weston and Sampson was the successful respondent, and over the next several months, they worked alongside the city and the public to produce preferred design options for the site areas, which I'll be showing in the next couple of slides. In association with Weston and Sampson were Stoss Landscape Urbanism and Woods Hole Group as a part of the consulting team. This year, after the completion of that first 20% design phasing, the BPDA is currently in the process of applying to FEMA's Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, HMGP, as a sub-applicant with MEMA, Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. So we're currently working with AECOM on the application, which is due by this December. We are in coordination with other city departments, such as CAT and Environment, as well as Massport, the MBTA, and adjacent property owners. You can go to the next slide. So here you can see the existing site elevations of these two project areas. The goal of this project is to bring the site elevations in Carlton Wharf and Lewis Mall up to 22.5 Boston City Base, BCB. Currently, the Carlton Wharf area in the top left-hand corner of this slide is between 16 and 18 BCB, and Lewis Mall is between 14 and 20. Each of these areas are a part of Boston's historic fill area and are low-lying, as you can see. But the adjacent properties that have been redeveloped over the last couple of years in black here on the slide have been redeveloped past the 22.5. So these projects will be working to act as tie-ins for the whole community solution. Next slide, please. As is always the case, and as my colleagues have been mentioning, all of this requires a lot of coordination with many different stakeholders. This map here lays out who the adjacent property owners are, as well as some of the existing infrastructure and other agencies who are required to be accounted for in any of the engineering and design concepts in order to finalize the development of these permittable and buildable solutions. So in addition to the adjacent property owners, we have the MBTA tunnel that runs under Lewis Mall. We have the BWSC, Boston Water and Sewer Commission, easements and outfalls. You have the condition of the existing seawall that needs to be taken into account, all of the environmental conditions, the water taxi service at Lewis Mall, and there's also an existing dog park at Carlton Wharf. Next slide, please. So the images that I am showing now, please take them all with a grain of salt. Remember, this is all at 20% design. None of what you're seeing right now is the final, but rather the beginning stages of what is to come. So here is that preferred design that came out of the Weston and Sampson report in 2021 rather. And Carlton Wharf provides a flood alignment, which ties into the high elevation marks of the Mark and Clippership Wharf, which are at 22.5 BCB. This design preserves that existing dog park. It enhances the existing natural landscape, as well as enhances views of downtown Boston. Following along the side street, the approach toward flood protection is through a gently sloped landscape with planted trees and native plants, which also help to mitigate heat. Next slide, please. This is just a sample rendering, again, designed by Weston and Sampson and team from that report, which there will be a link to in a later slide. Next slide. So now with Lewis Mall. Lewis Mall, this area over the course of Weston and Sampson, that CZM grant period, they developed a couple of solutions. Ultimately, based on community feedback, a phased approach was brought to the table. So this phased approach, I'm going to be mostly talking on the phase 1 slide right here. The phased approach is to help increase flood protection of the public realm improvements over time, and to help focus on mitigating existing and near-term flood risk. There are opportunities to expand into the public rights of way at the end of Lewis Street to create a larger landing in space to accomplish changes in grade, and the feasibility of expanding into the waterway, which would require coordination with state and federal regulatory environmental agencies, is the reason why this phased approach is being used. So phase 1 here, it utilizes the existing right-of-way as a limit of work to establish an interim design flood elevation of 19.5 BCB. This design prioritizes accessibility and movement along the waterfront while providing the flexibility to be built upon in the future to get it up to that 22.5. This approach provides protection during near-term flood events, while the grander, more complex design for phase 2 is being funded, permitted, and fully designed. The phase 1 approach, design flood elevation of 19.5 BCB, reduces the fill needed to create coastal protection and allows for a less obstructed view in the near term. While view corridors have not been formally analyzed yet, the elevation of Maverick Station is 18.5, so the views to the waterfront from the station are not expected to be impacted significantly with this interim solution. Direct access to the waterfront from Lewis Street is illustrated through the simple circulation and ramps. So you can go ahead and show the next slide. So this is the phase 2 design. And again, I'd just like to reiterate that the HMGP grant that we are going for right now will not be touching this phase. We are actually just working on phase 1 because as of this moment, this phase is not permittable for a buildable solution, but would require more coordination in the future. Next slide. So this is just a rendering of those 2 phases, phase 1 on the top, phase 2 on the bottom. Next slide. So again, this project is in a very, we've got years to go on this project. I invite folks to continue engaging with us at the BPDA on this project. The HMGP grant is just the next step in this phase. We want to build something that is right for all of the stakeholders involved, We are working, like I said, with the property owners right now, with the different state and local agencies on getting this grant through so that we can begin this process of bringing those early designs to the full buildable design solutions for the future. So please feel free to reach out to us and work with us together to make this possible. And now I'll pass it to Allison to round out the presentations.
Hi, everybody. I'm Allison Perlman. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a project manager at Boston Parks. Looking through the crowd, I see a lot of familiar faces. So thanks for joining our conversation, and I'm excited to continue it with you. Next slide. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about Mary Ellen Walsh Greenway project, which is formerly known as the East Boston Greenway. To give you some context, Mary Ellen Walsh Greenway is located in East Boston. The city-owned Greenway section is roughly a half mile from Porter Street to Marginal Street. It's kind of sandwiched between Massport's Bremen Street Park and Marginal Street Waterfront. Next slide. East Boston, as we know it today, was very early on a series of islands inhabited by indigenous peoples and supported a landscape of hunting and fishing. Over time, the lands were filled like much of Boston history that we heard about today. And by early 19th century, East Boston was a center of shipping and trade, and with that came the need for rail lines. The Mary Ellen Walsh Greenway was a reclamation of this former urban infrastructure, the Conrail Railroad Corridor. Today, you can find remnants of the Greenway's past, including old rail tracks, a Conrail caboose, affectionately referred to as the Blue Caboose, and a low-lying corridor, which now is surrounded by a dense urban environment and a series of parking lots. Next slide. Today, the Greenway is used at the neighborhood scale as a backyard for families to safely teach their kids to ride bikes or provide a valuable open space in this dense neighborhood. It's also used as an active and vital corridor for connecting residents to each other, local businesses, and work. And future envisioned Greenway extensions can serve as regional connections. In recent years, through the hard work of the Friends of Mary Ellen Walsh Greenway and other organizations, programming and small projects have been inserted into the Greenway, adding vibrancy, community connection, and resiliency education. Next slide. The Greenway is a landscape of opportunities and challenges. And a neighborhood disproportionately impacted by climate change, the site is one of the greenest places in the neighborhood, with an extensive tree canopy providing needed heat mitigation. The site is also surrounded by an active and vocal community and organizations who are eager to participate in its transformation. Next slide. There's also some site challenges. The site history of the old railway corridor has created this elevationally low-lying landscape, which is prone to flooding. Existing elevations put the site at risk during a current 1% annual chance of flood, with flood depths projected to be over a foot at the entrance. In addition to coastal flood risk, this low-lying open space is a collection point for site and adjacent property stormwater and exhibits high groundwater elevations. Next slide. This is the same graphic you've seen in the previous presentations. This shows the existing flood pathways and also future flood pathways. The Climate Ready East Boston Phase 1 report highlighted flood depths at the Greenway could be as much as 2.5 feet by 2030 and close to 5 feet by 2070. The Greenway flood pathway not only impacts the Greenway, but serves as a corridor for floodwaters to the rest of the neighborhood. Next slide. So what's the big question, right? What are we going to do about this? That's kind of the conversation for today. So far, the city has implemented the Greenway flood wall at Sumner Street, and when deployed, provides protection from coastal flooding up to the current 1% annual chance flood level, plus 1 foot of freeboard. Beyond the storm, though, the water goes around the flood wall from Border Street. For a number of reasons, the strategy has been deemed short-term. One, as I mentioned, the rising sea levels may prove too much for the system to address. And then the second is the city of Boston continues to research other cities affected by recent hurricane events and their successes and challenges with resiliency efforts. One of the lessons learned
is that deployable should only be used to address immediate flood risks or in areas where deployable is the only solution feasible, such as transportation corridors. In times of crisis, deployables present an operational challenge. In the event of deployment, dedicated teams and equipment have to be dispatched, potentially simultaneously, on numerous sites to different neighborhoods across the city, which is a logistical and organizational challenge before and after storm events when our teams are needed elsewhere for other important city operations. Next slide. So our project is really early on in the site investigation and community engagement phase. We're working closely with our design team, Weston Sampson, and Friends of the Mary Ellen Walsh Greenway. However, we acknowledge that any long-term solution for the Greenway will be anchored in one, community input. What we've heard continually from the community in all neighborhoods is that there's a need to address resiliency in all projects, from heat to flooding and biodiversity. Specifically from the East Boston Climate Ready Phase 1 process, we heard there's a strong preference for passive green resiliency solutions, and our ongoing conversations with the community highlight the need to provide resiliency while also addressing everyday needs. The second is neighborhood level coordination. What you've seen today in the presentations is that it's going to take more than just one project to create these barriers in flood protection. So working closely with other city departments, Massport, other landowners to better understand how our projects support one another's resiliency efforts and create a network of open spaces which serve the community's needs. Long-term solutions also require comprehensive site analysis to understand existing conditions and also past improvement projects and understanding the successes and failures of them. And then future flood elevations. We can see that data keeps on shifting a little bit, so we need to keep up with the current data and make sure that our elevations are tying into others' elevations. Long-term solutions also focus on a landscape scale strategies to provide passive, consistent flood protection and heat mitigation while also providing co-benefits to all of East Boston's community, including improved shaded seating areas, community gathering spaces, increased biodiversity, and access to water. These long-term solutions will also be focused on maintenance to provide for a sustainable and lasting landscape. And finally, they'll be reliant on continued partnerships to expand outreach efforts and programming, leverage resources, and add vibrancy reflective of the surrounding community. So thank you for your time. I will add my email, or actually I think maybe the next slide has my email, has everybody's email. So if you want to engage with any of us, please reach out to us. Our emails are here. We would love to chat with you. Speaking for myself, I would love to connect with you about East Boston Greenway or Mary Ellen Walsh Greenway and join the conversation there. And I will turn it over to Kishore.
Great, thanks, Kat, Allison, Delaney, and B. That was fantastic. You've been at it, by some measures feels like a long time, but it's not very long. But thinking about at the city scale to almost the last inch in one presentation is quite exciting to see that we're not just thinking about the vision, but we're implementing a lot of this. This is phenomenal work. Also goes to show the interdepartmental and interdisciplinary coordination that is happening. So this is great. Thank you very much. The other point that I want to sort of put in perspective is that this is a new language. We don't know how to do this, and yet you are doing an amazing job of really thinking a large scale and also implementing it, which is quite exciting in a short period of 4 or 5 years at this point. So thank you for joining us. I will start with a couple of questions, and then I know that there are a number of questions in the audience that Alice will probably facilitate. So the first broader question is, over the duration of the past several years, working at different scales, what are some of the lessons that you've learned that are going to shape what might come next? I believe Allison or somebody mentioned, for example, about the deployable flood walls, but are there other broader community lessons, technical lessons that you've learned that people should know?
guess I can kick that off. I think, Boston is one of the first cities to really start comprehensively addressing resilience in the way that we have through Climate Ready Boston. So I think each plan that we've done, starting from the original report in 2016 all the way through the individual neighborhood plans, have sort of built upon each other and taken lessons learned and integrated new considerations into how we present the plans or the information that we assess. So I think one really good example of that is, between the phase 1 and the phase 2 plans, I was the project manager for the phase 2 planning effort, and something new that we did that wasn't included in the phase 1 plan at the time was really thinking about stormwater infrastructure and how stormwater management should be factored into to the development of solutions. So, I think, for example, in all of the solutions that were presented in the phase 2 plan, there was an entire spread in the report specifically talking about the different considerations around, Boston Water and Sewers infrastructure or MBTA's infrastructure, like things like that, to take into account drainage, so that when we are presenting different options and solutions, all of them have already been informed by those other elements. So we're not, potentially finding out that there's an outfall or that there's a tide gate that we weren't already considering in the development of the solution, that we might learn about down the line. So all of those have already been more or less informed by those conversations with the folks that own and manage that infrastructure. And so that's been taken into account. Anyone else?
I'll jump in. So this actually goes to answer John's question in the chat as well, regarding the development projects. So we, of course, are continuing to learn these Climate Ready Boston reports. They're new. 5 years is still really new. And so the science is always being updated. The flood models are always being updated. And with the projects that I showed on the screen that were already elevated, when they were being reviewed, permitted, and authorized, we actually didn't have the benefit of the flood modeling and the Climate Ready Boston reports at that time. But these lessons are being learned. And actually, if you take a look at projects like 425 Medford Street, 1141 Bennington Street, Dorchester Bay City. These are all current projects that are integrating that modeling work and the Climate Ready Boston details into that design. So we have learned our lesson, and we are working to move all of that forward so that it can be less of a solution after developments are put in and more of a solution while those projects are advancing now.
And I just wanted to add something as well. I think that we are so focused on the planning part of it and the design part of it and even the construction part of it. But I think one of the big lessons that we're starting to learn is the operations and maintenance end of it. What happens at the end, which is probably one of the most important things as well. And the lesson learned is just really kind of bringing in our maintenance teams early on to understand what they're capable of doing, and then understanding how to kind of lay the groundwork for the framework to build up our teams. And then also to understand outside contracts that are needed for us to meet kind of permitting requirements, long-term permitting requirements, or the maintenance needs, that we're going to have to really look at more creative solutions for operations and maintenance, and really relying on kind of a partnership approach with the entirety of City of Boston. So I think that that's one big lesson we're learning. And I think as these projects get implemented, we'll continually kind of go back through the circle and look at adaptive management and how we can do things better, be more efficient, and how does that feed back into the design and planning process.
Terrific. So Alice, should we open up for questions?
Sure. We've got some questions in the chat, so we can start with those, and then I can also call on people, or people can continue to ask questions in the chat. I know a couple people wanted to just share some thoughts. One of the early questions, I think it was when Kat was presenting, Rebecca Shore asks about implementation. So let me sort of scroll up and pull it out. and maybe this is to all of you, but to Kat, who do you imagine will be implementing and constructing these projects and adaptations? We sort of alluded to some of the places, but if you could speak at all to the sort of breakdown between private companies, government agencies, and the youth corps that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so much of the implementation depends on who owns the land. So a lot of the work with Climate Ready Boston focuses on identifying where solutions can be constructed on publicly owned land, whether that's public parks like what B is working on with Ryan Playground, or public right-of-ways along roads or other areas that are managed by not just the city but also state and federal agencies, because then we can bring projects potentially to implementation more efficiently when they're under a singular land ownership. But of course, Boston has a lot of mixed property ownership along the waterfront. There's a lot of private property, and so that's where, like Delaney was saying, we're working with private developers through the BPDA's Article 80 process, among other efforts, to make sure that solutions that we need to have spanning, multiple property ownership boundaries are being coordinated, that the elevations are matching, so there aren't, these kind of like, I've heard like the crooked teeth kind of example of making sure that these elevations are matching and not potentially not coordinated. So, it varies. It varies a lot. We've talked mostly about projects that are being led by our various public agencies, but yeah, I mean, we've been working with National Park Service for the phase 2 area, so they've been working to integrate considerations from our planning effort into plans that they're working on with the National Park Service site in the Navy Yard. Other examples are, in East Boston around the Belle Isle Marsh that's owned by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. So we've also been working with them to integrate flood protection into work that they're looking at through a project that they're currently leading to study the health of the Belle Isle Marsh. So there's, a lot of different stakeholders. It really comes down to the individual property owners, and, us being at the city, we are very concerned with wanting to protect our communities and make our city one of, the greatest and safest places, in the wake of all these unprecedented threats that climate change is bringing. So it really requires us as the city to sort of shepherd these processes, stay engaged with these processes, and help the property owners bring the solutions that we've identified through the Climate Ready Boston work to life.
Great, thanks. And I think, we've seen that the Harbor Walk has been built by individual property owners, and in some cases it's lovely. In some cases you feel the difference between different properties. It definitely will be a challenge to link it all together. John Walkie had a few more questions that I think are good sort of overarching questions. One of them, and it's sort of yes or no, if any of the work that has been done so far looks at how sea level rise is impacting the level of the water table. And Allison, that might be relevant to your project. Kat, I don't know if you looked at it on yours.
Yes, I am. And it's a scary thing to think about. That's kind of why I put the graphic in there, is that I think I haven't necessarily looked at it at the Greenway yet, because we're still kind of at that early phase of investigations, but we have looked at it on another project I'm working on, and it creates a really complex system to understand rising groundwater, increased stormwater, and then coastal flooding. And I think, some of the modeling starting to take a look at that, but we are learning more and more. And so that's why I kind of continue to mention that data, that we need to follow the data, we need to follow the latest research, and that groundwater is going to be really impactful in our projects. And thinking about, just talking with the new director of green infrastructure of the city, Kay England, understanding that that's why it's so important also to kind of think about infiltrating stormwater, because we do want to keep the groundwater levels at some certain elevation to keep salt intrusion from happening as well. So there's all these, it's a balance and understanding how we manage all of that, so that, and let's say that we build a berm to keep the sea level rise out, and then the groundwater comes up behind it. What are we going to do there? So yes, we are thinking about it. We're trying to add that into the modeling and understanding of how we design systems, and we are still working it out, but I think it's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up.
Another bigger meta question from Susan. What other efforts are there happening to secure additional funding? So you guys have talked about CZM grants are out there for design. hazard mitigation grants are there from FEMA to do some level of construction? What are other sources you see or anticipate?
I think we're seeing, a lot of new funding from the recent infrastructure bill, but there are also a number of other grant programs like the BRIC grant, or the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant, I believe is what that stands for, which is also through FEMA. So that's another source. Different agencies at the state level beyond just CZM have grant opportunities related to coastal resilience. Some of them focus more on, projects that are leaning more into nature-based solutions like ecological restoration projects, whereas others, are more related to the infrastructure itself. I've seen grant programs coming out through the Massachusetts Area Planning Council. I think that's their acronym, or MAPC. So, there's a lot of different sources, and in addition to different grant applications from, all these different state and federal or like regional programs, there's also more money being allocated within city and state capital budgets for specifically resilient infrastructure projects.
Great. There's a couple specific questions about Charlestown. So I guess for B, one person, Desmond, asked about parking. How do people park without as much parking? I think I know the answer to this from going to your public meetings, but I'll let you chime in.
So currently, Ryan Playground has, I think we have 2 lots, one of which accommodates 28 cars and the other is unstriped, but could accommodate probably like 20. And every time that I've been there, and I don't go there all the time, so I'm not a great example, but I've seen like a car in one of the lots. One of the requirements that the Schrafft's building has, or what they've agreed to, is under the current agreement, I think they're required to provide 7 spaces for the playground, but we have been working with them and they have generously offered to continue to provide parking at the level that they've been providing it at, which is significant. And luckily, the timing that games happen, ball games where more parking is required generally, are on weekends or evenings when their facility is not using their parking for their offices. So we've incorporated 6 spaces in our new design, including an ADA, a few ADA spots. And the idea is that you could pull in, drop off things, pull out, use the parking if you need ADA accessibility, but otherwise you'd be using the Schrafft's parking lot. So it is a reduction in parking, to be sure, but we will also be increasing bike parking and be including a city bike parking, but bike dock area. So we're really trying to encourage different modes of transportation as well.
For Kathy's question. And this, I don't know if this is Delaney because you mentioned it, or B, because you're following the Ryan Playground stuff. 425 Medford is planning on building a seawall. What happens to properties that abut the wall? Won't floodwaters just be pushed down to vulnerable areas? And maybe you can talk a little bit about elevation in Charlestown, or maybe Kat, it comes up in climate ready planning.
Yeah, let me jump in quickly just for my theme with that site. We are literally right up against it. And so we've been working with them closely. Our project is ahead of theirs. Luckily, we both agreed to work at elevation 22. That's one of those things that it is one of the more conservative elevations to be putting things at. I realize that Delaney, you indicated 22.5 is some of the East Boston elevations, but they're a private entity, and I'm glad that they elected to do 22 because all elevation costs money, right? And so for us to both have that same elevation in mind is ideal, and we will be providing them with our plans. And they have agreed to, essentially, we're going to be merging our sites. We have sort of like a phase 1 entrance right now, leading in off of their parking lot, which is going to remain at its current elevation until they do their project. And once that happens, we anticipate there's going to be some further adjustment. They're going to be meeting our project. We're going to probably have to adjust a ramp I think. But that's what happens on our site. And then you're right, further down the coast of Charlestown, I actually don't know what the elevation is there, but perhaps Delaney or Kat could speak to that.
Yeah, so it's a really great question. And we think about those things here, right, when we're reviewing these developments. And I don't have a specific answer on that project right now myself. But we have a really great team of reviewers who work on the climate change and environmental planning at the BPDA, and it's their job to think about those things. So while I don't have a specific answer for that project off the top of my head, it is something that we think about and we take into account when doing all of these development reviews, because of course you don't want, like Kat mentioned, like Bee's talking about, to have that crooked teeth kind of implementation, right, that ultimately would affect someone else. That's what we're trying to avoid. So it's a great question.
Kathy, I see your follow-up comment. I think one thing to keep in mind is that different places have different elevations. So I'm going to actually bounce back to East Boston. And I don't know, Delaney, if you want to pull up, or guys, Kat has the slides to show that like some places it ties into things. So it's not necessarily that it's pushing water somewhere else because the other something is at the right elevation. I feel like I'm maybe not describing this super well. But like I know in Charlestown, like the new elevations are blocking flood pathway, like specific flood pathways. So that might help.
Let me know if this is the right slide, if you want to jump in on that question.
Maybe pull up the, I think it's the third slide, my deck of the,
This one?
that one. Yeah, right. So as Alice is saying, right, there's elevation changes constantly. So for these two projects, for example, Carlton Wharf acts as a tie-in between that Clipper Ship Wharf 25 BCB area, and then the elevation that you can't see at the top left of that screen. And then Lewis Mall acts as the tie-in between that building just to the left of it, and then the Piers Park Massport site, as well as that 22.5 BCB, the right-hand black block of elevation. And so this is the sort of thing that we would be looking at when doing these redevelopments. It's something that we would be looking at when doing 425 Medford, any of these other projects, to make sure that there aren't any holes and gaps in these areas. We look at where the flood pathways are. In some instances, you know, the flood pathways are actually just fringe flooding, as what Kat was mentioning earlier. So every site is different. Every site has these different considerations to look into. But overall, our intention is to make sure that we're not leaving open those major flood pathways, and we are taking into account all of this elevation change, all of these very highly specific details on every project.
Great, thanks. I have a couple of questions from Lavi. The first one, she asks about the park going through MIPA review, so presumably Ryan Playground. Could you explain why the DEIR is needed? For those of you following along at home, that is an environmental impact review. Why it's needed and what additional designs or details are being required. Is something about the design that requires something special?
So this is a new requirement that we discovered, and it's as of January 2022, There are requirements having to do with whether or not your project is located in an environmental justice neighborhood. So it's a good origin for the additional scrutiny, I think. The idea is that if you have a project within a mile of an environmental justice neighborhood, there is additional reporting that has to happen. And then an environmental impact report could be required. We're actually in the process. We've done our notification, which is the first step. And so they're going to let us know after they review that if we need to do an environmental impact report. And the idea is that for years you have these isolated language isolation areas or low income areas or underserved, whatever falls under the umbrella of environmental justice. And there have been a lot of projects that have gone on without this awareness by those communities and the lacking their ability to participate and sort of create any direction there. So I don't know what if we're going to be required to do it. If we do, it's going to add a little bit more time and we'll have to create some more graphics and more information about our project. As far as the impacts of the park renovation, I have a hard time believing that there would be real challenges with submitting an environmental impact report. It's not like we're doing like a coal gasification plant or a mall or something that would, but I respect the origin of the additional requirements, and if we're required to do them, then so be it. We're working with that. So I hope that answered your question.
A broader question to more of you. She also asks if there are Chapter 91 licenses needed for any of these projects, and is there an opportunity to implement a living shoreline along the seawalls?
Yeah, so in the development projects that are touching the waterways, right, Chapter 91 would be required. The question of implementing living shoreline along seawalls is kind of separate, and maybe I'll let Kat answer that one. But yes, Chapter 91 would be needed.
Yeah, I think the living shorelines question, it depends on the site and how the harbor is being used. So in some locations, like thinking about the recent work in East Boston around Belle Isle Marsh, like a living shoreline would make sense because it's already an ecosystem. But in some areas, like in the Boston harbor, it might be harder to construct a living shoreline where water is deeper, there's higher velocity, the water is still being used for marine uses like marinas or shipping or things like that. I think we want to be exploring opportunities for those kinds of benefits that provide habitat and improve water quality and all of those types of amazing benefits that living shorelines can provide. But I think, Allison touched on this in her presentation, maintenance of living shorelines is a really important aspect to make sure that they thrive and they do what we want them to do. And so I think that this is where it kind of comes hand in hand of we need to make sure that we have a workforce in place to be able to help us with maintaining this this really critical infrastructure that needs some tender loving care, especially in those early implementation years.
I also wanted to just talk a little bit about Bryan, and we have our seawall there, and we're not doing any living, oyster beds in the harbor or anything like that. And it was hard, as a landscape architect with awareness of all of these different shoreline developments. I moved from New York City, where there are a lot of exciting projects there going on as well, oyster beds and that kind of thing. So I was sort of interested to see where this project was going to go and excited at the opportunities. And this is really one of those challenging situations where, the point of the Parks Department, we balance ecology with human use, and they don't always work well together. And the real importance of this site, as far as the community is concerned, is active recreation. And that is really requiring large flat areas. And so one of the designs that was sort of explored in the Climate Ready Phase 1 report was cutting into the site and having some sort of wetland area and having some steps going down into the water, which was really exciting and dynamic. However, would have reduced the usable flat space on the site significantly. So, it's a balancing act. And in this case, this was something where the priorities for the community were really to continue to use the park actively for sports. And so that was the direction that we went. But it's not something that was like, okay, obviously we'll just go with sports. It was something that we looked at and we really anyway, it's a balancing act.
Thanks, Bea. There's a few questions still in the chat from John Walkie, Gerald, James Lee, Chrissy, and Eric. If any of the presenters want to sort of scroll through and provide some other answers to those. And then I know Lois has a couple comments. So Lois?
I'm Lois Siegelman, president of the Friends of the Charlestown Navy Yard and also trustee of the Constitution Museum. I have been involved worrying about flooding in the Navy Yard for about 10 years. So I've been thinking about this for a long time. There has been no involvement for anybody in the Navy Yard getting involved with the Navy Yard flooding. It used to say to me, oh, there's a plan for Charlestown. I go, yeah, that's great, Ryan Playground. But part of Charlestown that's vulnerable as well is the whole Navy Yard. And there's been nothing planned or talked about. The thing I've heard is two variations. Do raise First Avenue or raise the Harbor Walk. I want to tell you that you can't do that easily here. Every part of the Harbor Walk, number one, is controlled by individual condominiums. One section, a large section of it, actually has lawsuits going back and forth and is in decrepit state. I've fallen on it and injured my shoulder because nobody's maintaining it. So you're going to have a real hard time. In any place you have a gap is going to be a problem because that's where you're going to have flooding coming in. Each part of the Harbor Walk, maybe a driveway or a large swath, and it's controlled by the BPDA, by Pier 7, by Paris Landing, by the Marina, etc. The other thing is, if you do the Harbor Walk and raise it, you have to have access to the piers, which are going to flood. You can't raise them. And you have to have ways to get trucks, trains, cars and buses onto the different piers. So it would be piers 4, 6, 7, 8. And there's no plan for that. You can't do gardeners out there to help flood and mitigate. So I need to know that somebody's actually thinking about what to do and will actually involve somebody from the Navy Yard in the planning. I think the plans are great for other places, but there's nothing for the Navy Yard I'm aware of.
Hey, Lois, good to see you. Yeah, so, with your point to no involvement, we just did the section of climate ready planning that looked at the Navy Yard in this most recent plan, which was released in August. So I'm happy to share that with you if you haven't already come across that, so you can see what we put forward with our most recent plan. Because we like I explained earlier, we divided Charlestown into 2 phases, just given the extent of that flood pathway that comes up through the Schraff Center and Ryan Playground that would not only touch Boston, but would also touch our neighbors in Cambridge and Somerville. And so the Charlestown Navy Yard was included in this most recent phase of planning. So if that's a concern around a lack of planning, it's because it was our most recent plan.
There's no involvement from us though. Nobody's been in touch with the Navy Yard about it.
Okay.
Friends of the Charlestown Navy Yard, any other organization here?
Well, we met with the Friends of the Charlestown Navy Yard. We had a meeting that I believe you were in, along with others from the different condo associations in the Navy Yard.
Years
and
ago.
we had one earlier this year. We've been talking to friends of the Navy Yard. We've been talking to the individual condo owners. We've been working with the National Park Service. We've had multiple community meetings. We've had our community advisory boards in Charlestown. So we've had engagement. I'm sorry that you feel like you haven't been included enough.
I have not been engaged. I have not been.
Well, then we can still talk. There's still a lot more to come. We've laid out a plan. I can even pull up I have a little supplementary slide back here looking at sort of the solutions for the Navy Yard. You know, the Navy Yard is a really complicated area. It's historical. There's a lot of uses there that we want to preserve. It's built out really close to the water's edge. You know, it's all hardscape. There's, you know, the need to preserve those waterfront industrial uses. So it's a really, really challenging area. And we know that the property ownership is, you know, there's a lot of different property owners, from Massport to the BPDA to individual private property owners to the National Park Service. You know, it crosses private, city, state, federal, so many different property owners. So we know that there's going to need to be a concerted effort when it comes to the actual development of solutions in the Navy Yard. And so we looked at alternatives that, you know, wrap the edge of the Navy Yard to make sure that we are, you know, protecting as many of the individual properties in that area as possible, as well as you mentioned, you know, an alternative solution along, can you see my mouse? It's, you know, this First Avenue corridor, which is the first publicly owned right of way in the Navy Yard, as a backup option. And, you know, everything that we heard through our community engagement process, which spanned, you know, the almost 2 years of the project, you know, was asking folks like, would you prefer something more at the water's edge? Would you prefer something further back? What do we do in this situation? And what we kept hearing was that folks wanted to see a solution that would be as close to the water's edge as possible, which is why we leaned into the, you know, the option of elevating the Harbor Walk, which is a similar proposal as what was put forward through the Downtown North End plan and the South Boston plan, where it's a similar condition of a lot of, you know, piers and bulkheads and properties that are all the way out to the water's edge, where, you know, if we were to pull a line of protection further back, that leaves a lot of buildings exposed. So, you know, within the recent report, we were even able to work with our experts at Woods Hole Group, who are, you know, genius modelers, to really break down the compartments of flood risk in the Navy Yard and across our phase 2 study area to really dig in and understand which are the lowest lying segments of the Harbor Walk in Charlestown, which segments need to be addressed first. Because if we were to try to elevate the entire Harbor Walk in the Navy Yard in one swoop, that would be really, really complicated and expensive and really challenging to coordinate. So by being able to break it down into individual segments and, you know, work like focus on the areas that are the most exposed first, we're able to, you know, break that down and develop solutions that can be as creative and innovative as some of the projects that have been described by my colleagues here. And, you know, within the scope of a planning process like the Climate Ready Boston efforts, you know, we don't have the ability in these planning studies to do deep technical engineering on like a parcel by parcel basis to understand the types of complexities that, you know, Bea spoke to around, you know, electrical and gas lines and things like that. So that's where that next phase of design and engineering really is important and involves additional engagement. So, you know, there's more to come with the Navy Yard. I hope that we can talk more about that and that you'll stay engaged as these like individual projects start coming forward, because, you know, it's gonna take all of us. It's gonna take a lot of different communications and coordination efforts across these different property owners. So, you know, thank you for the points that you raised.
No, the point I'm still making is, if you look at the map, piers 3, 4, 6, and 7 are all, and 8 are all going to be underwater. There is nothing done to allow access to them. It means you're going to eliminate courageous sailing, the Pier 6 restaurant marina, Pier 8 marina, and Pier 7 housing, 63 condos. There's all that's sticking out in the water still. What do you do about those?
Yeah, so we've been talking, Jerry Angoff is actually on the call from Constellation Wharf, which is a really unique property, given that it's one of the only residential properties that's on a pier in all of the city of Boston. So we've been working to figure out, you know, what are some options for that property to, you know, wrap it in protection, to adapt the building itself in the near term. But, you know, with some of these piers that are very vulnerable and low lying, it's very expensive to elevate a pier. And climate change is a threat that we have to, you know, we have to really think about. And in some places, we may have to change, like, is courageous sailing, maybe they can launch from a different area of the city that's safer, that won't be constantly inundated. So, you know, in some of these places, we have to think about changes, and it's painful, it's scary. You know, all of us who work for the city of Boston are required to live in the city of Boston, so we're stakeholders in this work too. And, you know, there are some changes that we're going to have to, you know, really dig into and figure out that may not be what we want to see, but maybe what we have to do in order to make sure that we're safe.
Thanks so much, Kat. And I'll let Lois and Kat follow up. There are links now in the chat to multiple project presentations that you saw today. So if you want to follow along with these projects, all of these project managers are super accessible. You've met them today, so you also know that they're kind humans, and you can reach out to them. I want to thank my colleagues, Kathy Abbott, as well as Kelly, Jen, and Melanie for tuning in today, and I'll turn it over to Kishore to wrap it up.
Great, thanks everyone once again for joining. I was, we could have gone for another couple hours maybe, but it goes to show that these problems are complex and it's not just the city that is responsible. All of us have to play a role in making this successful. It's great to see all four of you, Kat, Allison, B, and Delaney, really dedicated to making sure that we're all safe, secure, and also friendly to our environment. So the conversation continues. Please feel free to reach out to any of us or any of the panelists with further discussion. With that, we'll close this conversation and look forward to having you join us the next time. We'll post that information of the next Harbor Forum later. We don't have the dates yet. Alice, is that right? But you'll be seeing a communication from us.
4th Wednesday in October. Someone on this call owes me an email, so let me know if he can present. Hopefully he can. Thanks.
Thank you.